This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a monumental, really a foundational question today that sits right at the intersection of, history, religion, and philosophy.
It really does.
We're basically asking, what if the initial structural design, the intellectual architecture, if you will, of a religion's founding text, what if that determines the entire long-term path of the civilization it creates?
It's more than just a massive if. I mean, it's the very hinge upon which the divergent paths of Western civilization and classical Islamic civilization really turn.
Okay, so we're comparing early Christianity and early Islam.
Exactly, but looking past the theology, we're focusing entirely on their initial intellectual and, their legal blueprints.
And to really frame how profound this difference is, let's start with, I think, the most dramatic what-if scenario.
Let's do it.
What if Jesus had not been the humble rural preacher, the figure we all know from the Gospels, but instead a successful military general who defeated Rome and founded a unified religious state? Maybe something like a samurai-like regime, a Bush administration.
That simple IF. Well, it would have meant the end of the West as we know it.
Really? That dramatic?
Absolutely. If Christ had been a military and political leader, Christianity would have been structurally identical to early Islam from day one. You'd have religion, military power, politics, and a comprehensive legal code all integrated into one supreme unified state.
And for the listener who, may not be familiar with that Japanese analogy, what does a Bushi administration imply in political terms?
It implies a unified, centralized military and administrative government. It's run by an elite class of warriors, and crucially, political authority and legal jurisdiction are fully fused under that single religious or military leader.
So stability is maximized.
Stability is maximized, fragmentation is minimized. It's the total opposite of medieval Europe.
So if that unified Christian state had existed, the consequence is no 1,000 years of political chaos.
None. The very chaos that defined the European Middle Ages would be gone. But also, and here's the truly shocking part, no scientific revolution. No Newton, no Galileo.
How can that be?
Because that period of, chaos and fragmentation in Europe, where you had kings fighting popes, cities gaining autonomy, universities competing with the clergy, that wasn't a weakness.
You're saying it was a strength.
It was the essential adaptive condition. A unified Christian state, structurally perfect like the early caliphate, would have had zero need for that internal intellectual tension. It would have had no room for the political fragmentation necessary to foster real rational debate. It would have achieved stability early, and stability, as we're about to see, often means rigidity.
So our mission then, for this deep dive, is to understand why the actual historical path, which, produced a fragmented, chaotic, but ultimately adaptable West, emerged from its specific foundational documents.
And why Islam's path was so different. Let's start with the foundations.
Right. I tend to characterize the New Testament, the NT, as the empty box. And, maybe to soften the language a bit, I see it as a sparse spiritual narrative. It's focused almost entirely on individual morality, redemption, simple parables. It focuses on this charismatic figure who, taught by a lake, worked miracles, and then ultimately he vanished.
And that sparseness is the critical intellectual characteristic. The NT is really defined by its emptiness. It contains virtually no codified law, no detailed economic principles, and certainly no defined political structure for running a government or an army.
And this emptiness, it wasn't a philosophical choice, was it?
Not at all. It was just a result of the historical context. Jesus was a rural figure. He spoke Aramaic. He was likely non-literate. His disciples were simple fishermen, tax collectors, artisans. They were not, highly educated scribes capable of writing systematic theology or a legal code for an empire.
So what they produced was emotionally powerful.
Incredibly powerful, but structurally incomplete.
Here's where it gets really interesting. That unintentional intellectual vacuum, the sheer sort of lightness and uncompleted nature of the NT, it became Christianity's greatest adaptive strength. It was an open vessel.
Right. It could absorb anything later on. The legal framework of Rome, the philosophy of Greece, the political systems of the Germanic tribes. It was a blank slate that didn't defend a complete political system because, it didn't have one to defend.
Now contrast that with Islam.
A complete contrast. Founded by Muhammad, he was not a rural preacher. He was an urban intellectual, a highly successful merchant from Mecca, a bustling city defined by trade, contracts, and, intense political diplomacy.
So the foundation itself, which is built on an entirely different scale of intellectual infrastructure.
Precisely. Muhammad had a significant layer of educated scribes and sophisticated companions around him, people who were already familiar with trade law, city administration, and contracts.
And the consequence of that.
The Quran's structure is, from the very beginning, comprehensive and full. It's the full bookcase.
The full bookcase.
It's detailed. It includes specific regulations for inheritance, for marriage, for contract enforcement, for war ethics. It's a complete legal, political, and historical documentary, ready to function as the constitution for a state. The scholarly difference between the two foundational texts is just astounding.
This has to lead to the crucial authority divide then.
Absolutely.
If the Christian vessel is empty, it needs an external authority, a hierarchy, to interpret all that ambiguity and impose order. And that, right there, that gave birth to theology as the central institutional authority.
And the clergy that came with it, priests, bishops, popes.
Right. But in Islam,
The principle of equality before God, combined with that comprehensive legal text, meant a hierarchical clergy was structurally unnecessary. In fact, it eventually became impossible. Authority was vested not in abstract theological debates guided by an institution, but in jurisprudence and law sharia and fiqh.
hold on, if the Quran is so complete, why do they need a massive body of legal scholars, the fiqh, at all? Shouldn't the text just speak for itself?
That's an excellent challenge. The book provides the structure and the core law, the sharia. But as any society grows, you need interpretation for new situations, new contracts, new technologies.
Okay.
So fiqh develops to handle the application of the law to these specific, complex, open cases. But the key difference is that the law itself is divine and integrated into the state from the start. There's no external intellectual space for a separate, parallel institution like the papacy to dominate.
So to put a bow on that point, the empty box needs a pope to tell you what goes inside it,
Correct.
while the full bookcase needs judges and legal scholars to simply interpret the application of what's already there.
Exactly. The structure dictates the power dynamic.
And this contrasting foundation, it sets the stage for how each civilization dealt with external rationalism, specifically the ultimate threat and, well, the greatest tool, Greek philosophy.
And what we see is a structural pattern of rejection. But it's separated by centuries, and that time difference shows how the West was able to adapt, while the East, having absorbed the ideas too early into a hardening structure, eventually rejects them.
So the West, centered on that sparse NT narrative, it initially rejects Greek philosophy as something alien, dangerous, the devil's wisdom.
Yes, and this reached its political climax in the 6th century. The symbolic moment was when the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian closed the Athenian Academy in 529 CE. This was the official creation of a massive intellectual vacuum in the West.
For centuries.
For centuries, the West spent hundreds of years actively trying to forget Aristotle.
Meanwhile, Islam was doing the exact opposite.
Initially, yes, they were the world's intellectual powerhouse. Islam absorbed Aristotle and Plato early on between the 8th and 9th centuries. The libraries of Baghdad and Cordoba became the absolute centers of Aristotelian study while Europe was, intellectually dark.
But the internal dynamics of the full bookcase eventually caught up.
They did. The structural tension between a comprehensive, divinely revealed legal code and radical human reason just proved to be too much.
So we see an echo.
We see a structural echo of that 6th century ban in the West, but it's occurring 5 centuries later in the Islamic world. In the 11th century, you have al-Ghazali, arguably the most influential Islamic scholar of his era, launching a profound attack on philosophy in his work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers.
So even though Islam got Aristotle first, the rigid, law-centered system ultimately couldn't tolerate rationalism that threatened God's immediate power. What was his major target, philosophically?
His core target was the Aristotelian idea of natural causality, the belief that predictable, inherent laws govern the universe. If A causes B and B causes C, that suggests the universe runs like a clockwork machine.
And why is that a threat to the divine structure?
Because it places limits on God. If natural causality is true, then God is merely the initial clockmaker who sets things in motion. Ghazali insisted that God is the immediate cause of every single event.
Every single one.
Everyone. If a feather falls, it is not gravity. It is God willing that feather to fall at that exact microsecond. This restored the absolute arbitrary omnipotence of God, but it simultaneously crippled scientific inquiry by removing the philosophical basis for observation and experiment.
And this caused philosophy to just steeply decline in the Islamic world.
Yes, demonstrating that the full bookcase, once it had hardened, lacked the structural flexibility to integrate truly threatening external ideas. That was the second removal of philosophy.
And that philosophical decline coincided with the West just starting to stir.
Precisely. If we trace the fate of Aristotle, the West, symbolized by the rise of scholasticism, was roughly 200 years behind the intellectual peak of the Islamic world. The 13th century for the West was the 10th century for Islam.
That two-century gap created the perfect intellectual handoff.
It did. The West, desperate to fill its centuries-old vacuum, was perfectly positioned to adopt what Islam had already filtered and was now actively throwing out.
The key figure in that handoff is Avicenna.
Avicenna, living around the 10th and 11th centuries, he didn't just translate Aristotle, he was a radical, creative system builder. He used Aristotle's ideas as raw logic to create a fully systematized philosophy for medicine, psychology, and theology.
So Avicenna built this incredibly advanced system, but it was too ambitious. The hardening Islamic religious authorities couldn't stomach his additions. What were those specific additions they found so heretical, his impure ornamentation?
The main ones were concepts like emanation and necessary existence. Avicenna proposed that reality flowed out from the divine in a layered, necessary process of emanation, not just the sudden act of creation.
Okay, that's a big deal.
And he argued that there were certain necessary existence, things that must exist outside of God's immediate will. These ideas were highly rational, but they utterly destroyed the simplicity of a singular, arbitrary divine creator, as interpreted by the traditional legal scholars.
So he created a system that was too perfect, too rational for the full bookcase to handle.
Exactly. Which brings us to Averroes in the 12th century. Averroes attacked Avicenna, viewing his work as polluting Aristotle with those synthetic, unnecessary additions. He dedicated his life to stripping away Avicenna's embellishments to restore a pure, unadorned Aristotle. He performed the vital intellectual cleanup.
And then we get to Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. He's the ultimate student who arrived just in time to pick up all the pieces.
And he succeeded precisely because of the Christian empty box.
So Aquinas used Averroes as his public textbook, the clean, politically acceptable, purified Aristotle. But he needed to know how to apply that raw logic to Christian concepts, which the original NT had left blank. I think of Avicenna's work as his secret cheat sheet.
The Ancho.
The Ancho.
That analogy of the Ancho, the private annotated study guides, it's fascinating. Aquinas didn't just cherry-pick. He used Avicenna's underlying methodology, the how-to guide for connecting concepts like necessity and existence to a religious narrative. He was able to integrate these sophisticated philosophical tools into the Christian framework because the empty box had structural room for them.
Something the already full Islamic structure just did not have.
It's a spectacular example of adaptation through weakness.
And we know Avicenna's legacy didn't just go through the front door of scholasticism.
That's right. His formal philosophical logic, purified by Averroes, went the front route into the universities via Aquinas. But Avicenna's practical, empirical methods, his focus on observation in medicine and psychology, that went the informal, practical back route.
To who?
Into figures like Roger Bacon and eventually Francis Bacon, hundreds of years later. This empirical tradition, born in the Islamic world, laid the essential observational foundation for the scientific revolution.
So the intellectual resources created by one civilization were rejected because it was too rigid, and then they were successfully cannibalized and integrated by another because it had a prior intellectual vacuum.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean?
It means the profound divergence between Western and Islamic civilization really stems from the structural nature of their founding documents. Christianity's initial weakness, the empty box, the uncompleted nature of the New Testament, was its ultimate adaptive strength. It allowed it to become a late exploding civilization that could absorb external rationalism 200 years later.
And Islam's structural strength, the full bookcase, the comprehensive law code of the Quran, made it spectacularly successful early on. It led the world in philosophy and science for centuries.
But that same completeness created an inflexible structure that ultimately resisted necessary philosophical integration and internal evolution. The strength of the two civilizations was inversely proportional to the completeness of their foundational texts.
So the possibility contained within the empty box
Proved to be limitless.
The entire discussion, ultimately, ends on that concept of productive emptiness. Why is the empty box the greatest source of power in history? And it seems we've found that blankness provides maximum possibility. It is the space for creation, the critical intellectual vacuum that allows for external absorption and, eventually, explosion.
And this profound concept is reflected across so many philosophical traditions. You see it in Zen's mu, or nothingness, Taoism's utility of non-being, even Aristotle's dynamis, or potentiality. The system that is not fully defined is the system that can grow without limit.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to explore. What other civilizational structures, whether political systems, economic models, or even artistic movements, gain their greatest power not from their codified completeness, their rigidity, or their definition, but from their uncompleted, empty nature? That is your next deep dive.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.